Hello everyone, I'm Mark. I have a Scottish accent. Does anyone have a problem with that? Here's how you clear into this one. Has anybody seen the film Shrek? Right, watch this, right? Donkey. I have exactly the same accent as Shrek. That's what 26 years in the United States has done me. I've turned into Shrek. All right, let's turn to populism. Time is short, let's get going. Populism is busting out all over, everywhere. In fact, there's so many of them, it's hard to fit them all on the map, so I didn't. I put them here. And over here you have the right-wing version, and over here you have the left-wing version, because there is a left-wing version of it too. It's the right that gets all the attention. Short version of how we get here. Two economic regimes. Basically, over time, the way that capitalist institutions fit together to produce income, wealth, growth, the whole 9 yards. Cold War era was defined by a full employment target. We had national economies. There was no real globalization. Financial markets were restricted. They were locked up in the US in their New Deal box, and there was an equivalent everywhere else. We had COLA contracts, or corporatist bargaining. We had big labor. We had big capital. We had agreements that panned entire economies in terms of wage setting. Inflation control was done through those types of contracts. Nobody had a clue who ran the central bank. There's a lot of information in that, right? And then finally, we had high taxes and transfers, which balanced out the system. Jump forward another 10 years, what we call the neoliberal era, 1980 to 2008. Price stability, not full employment, because the way we think about the economy has radically changed. Target R*, get the interest rate right, that'll happen automatically if you have enough flexibility in your labor markets. Globalization of product markets, supply chains, and particularly labor markets is very important, because what is labor's ultimate power? The power to hold up capital's profits. The minute you globalize labor markets, you take that power away. You open financial markets, which gives capital mobility a huge boost, whilst restricting labor mobility at the same time. But you make your labor markets flexible domestically, because the two of those things together, globalization and open financial markets, constitute, with independent central banks, your anti-inflationary control mechanism. On the back of this, you cut taxes for everybody who's got anything, and everybody, strangely, knows who runs the central bank, because rather than being the check cashing agency for the Treasury, which is what it used to be, it's now the most important institution in the world. Two distinct regimes, really. Have a look at this. US corporate profits, 10-year average. You were losing money hand over fist, inflation was killing you. You do a system reset and it comes back up. US inflation, exactly the same thing. That's what was killing your profitability. And then here's the real kicker. Have a look at Treasury yields. Isn't that beautiful? So what ended the first one? Inflation. So inflation destroys faith in paper assets. You had a portfolio of gilts in 1961, you were getting 4% real. It was fantastic. It was safe as houses. The Bank of England, you were making money. By 1971, you destroyed 70% of your clients' money simply by holding it because of inflation. So you needed a system reset. There was your reset. The rise of independent central banks and also neoliberal politics. A completely different software to run on the hardware of capitalism. That system failed. It wasn't bailed, it was restructured politically, argumentatively, intellectually, and sometimes violently. What ended the second regime? Debt and leverage. That regime ended, the neoliberal one, in 2008. Have a look at those numbers, if you can see them. Not even just Iceland's the funny one, right? 623% of GDP in a single bank. Have a look at Britain. Even have a look at Germany. Deutsche Bank had 86% of GDP as assets, but it was running a 2% capital cushion with 66-to-1 operating leverage on an average Tuesday. It was a giant accident waiting to happen. So what's happened between those two regimes? Well, when you let finance out of the box, it plays one trick and one trick only. The 1970s produced historically high and unprecedentedly high real interest rates. And as they declined over time, precisely because you're integrating capital markets around the world, that real interest rate falls. So how do you make money on a decline in spread? Pump up the leverage. That's the leverage crisis. So you built an incredibly fragile, tightly intertwined, tightly coupled micro market structure across the global financial system. It was just waiting for a crappy mortgage to come along. But this time we bailed it. There was no Reagan, there was no Thatcher, there was no intellectual revolution. Instead, we turned to the central banks and said, please deal with this. And we did. And in doing so, you created a giant liquidity and volatility constraint. which has been holding the system together ever since. Now, do you think that might have something to do with populism? What do you think? Let's have some clues. The red line is bank assets to GDP. Given that banks are essentially a pass-through, I like to call them the plumbing system of capitalism, there's absolutely no reason for them to grow at 3 times the rate of everything else in the house. And yet they did. That's the great levering up that happened because the interest rates are going down and you're building up leverage. Where did it all go? My favorite picture, pre-crisis picture. Can you see this one? Open a cravings account. No, not save up and buy yourself something nice, right? Open a cravings account. That was a $100 million advertising campaign from Citi called Live Richly. Let's just think about that for a minute. Live Richly cravings account, right? So where did all the leverage go? Right into here, here's Euro area consumer credit from 96 to 2017, which is a 300% increase. And here's US consumer credit, which basically does exactly the same. Wow, we're loading up our personal balance sheets like no tomorrow. That must be because we're all expecting huge wage growth in the future to do intertemporal consumption smoothing, like we all learned in school, right? Yeah, except there's no wage growth. So what you've been doing is filling in the gap that wages haven't actually allowed you to do. So you lever up on the expectation of future wage growth, but there's no future wage growth, so you continue to lever up. And when the system becomes fragile and goes bang, then you bail the system. And when you bail that system, what you're doing is bailing the creditors and doing an intergenerational and interclass put option on everybody else known as the taxpayer. This panel here is the most interesting one. The black line is the OECD average wage share, wage to capital ratio, beta in Piketty's terms. And that's at its all-time high, 1970s, because of inflation. That's where it is now. That's 2011. It's down to about here. It's not going anywhere. Now, if wages are related to productivity, which obviously they are because bankers get paid so much because they're so productive, right? Then have a look at the different panel growths, because what you find is 2008 to 2016, productivity has collapsed. So if that is your main hope, that we're going to become more productive, then wages really aren't going anywhere. Now, what happens when you bail out this massively levered system in 2008? The first thing is, public debt to GDP goes through the roof. Because basically you've taken private sector debt and socialized it and dumped it on the public balance sheet. Shh, don't tell the children, but that's really what we did, right? Here's the really surprising bit, however. Despite $13 trillion in central bank intervention directly on a cash basis, despite bailing the cost of the recession, despite the build-up in debt, despite $13 trillion in long-dated assets being issued since 2008, which are negative yielding, setting the long end of the curve globally, there's no bloody inflation anywhere. Now, this little spike up at the end, this is what Brussels is getting excited about just now. Don't worry, populism's gone, growth is back. Really? Watch this. Here's a problem. The 1970s was noise, it wasn't signal. Everything that we learned, me too, everybody in this room, generalized from the wrong part of the distribution. I'll show you why. This is the best graph in the world. I had to smuggle this out of the Japanese Prime Minister's office. It's fantastic. The Bank of Japan made this. That's why it's all in Japanese. I didn't write this. So what have you got here? You've got global real interest rates since 1350. Dutch perpetual bond, high, 10%, 8%, etc. What happens here? The Italians show up. They create secondary markets in debt. So once you get intermediation in debt markets, what happens? You've got a secondary market, so the rates go down. So then it starts to join up, and you join up those markets, and slowly but surely, what's the long-run real rate of interest for the global economy? Between 1.5% and 2%. So you get to the 1970s, and you've got 13.9 in treasuries. You've got gilts at 14.2. It's a crisis. It really is it's a crisis for profitability. It's a crisis for functioning capitalism. We did a system reset on that, and we thought, never again to inflation. Well, there's the end of that series. Go back to there. This bit here, right? That's going nowhere. And here's the policy rate since 1980, the big four. That's going nowhere. So your long-run rate of growth is 2. Your long-run rate of inflation is 1. Get used to it. Now, what does this have to do with populism? Add all this together and you get populism. People's debts are too high, their wages are too low, and their inflation's too low to eat away any of the debt. The left response is to blame capital and globalization, and the right response is to blame immigrants and globalization. As they say in Scotland, same shit, different smell. The results of this are creditor-debtor standoffs played out in party politics. The losers are actually the creditor classes who got bailed in 2008. The real value of debt goes up, but your ability to collect goes down. Big problem. Why is that? Well, those political parties that were identified with building that order, of which New Labour in Britain is the most emblematic. Think of Mandelson's line that says, I have absolutely no problem with people getting disturbingly rich so long as they pay lots of taxes. And then we get to redistribute, which is fine, but your entire model is completely fractured. I mean, it's based upon nothing but leverage, right? I mean, it's got to go. That's not a sustainable model. So those parties which abandon their core constituents on the left in favour of this trade-off with basically with finance, get hammered at the polls because they're correctly identified as basically shorting their own constituents. And they move to the middle sometimes takes them, but sometimes doesn't like them, so their vote share gets squeezed. What do you see on the right? Well, they're the winners. Can't pay, don't pay, will vote. And there you get nationalist right parties. And think of the discourse they all have in common. Taking back control. Renationalising markets. Globalization has been bad for us. Anti-trade, anti-euro, and crucially the one difference, anti-immigrant. You want to see how this affects left parties? Have a look at this. This is Matthew Gooden's work on this. This is the average vote for left parties. Pretty solid. And then basically you get up to the financial crisis and it falls right off a cliff. Here is social democracy at the polls today. When I went to graduate school, these guys, the Swedish SAP, they could honestly take a dead Labrador, stick a red rosette on it, put it in soda mom and get a majority of 40,000. Today, they can't get 25% of the vote. They're all dying. So your left's dying because your populists of both the left and the right are eating that part of the vote share. Your centre parties are still holding ground, as Merkel is showing, but at the cost of the left being unable to move in with any other types of policies. So you have pro-creditor alliances locked in place, central banks pumping endless amounts of money into the system as a forced liquidity and volatility constraint, and there's no solution at the end to the fundamental problem, which is essentially that beta, the capital-labour ratio, has gotten out of whack and there's no way to redistribute back, precisely for the reasons that Peter talked about. Last slide on this one. And then I'll stop. There's the predicted probabilities basically for the latest poll versus the last election. As you can see, we correctly got the fact that the Danish People's Party were going to lose. I like the fact that the Dutch are smart enough not to vote for someone who looks like Willy Wonka's evil twin. But the French is still something to worry about. And run this one out a little bit longer. Go to Italy. Go to any place in Europe where the real fault line is. The minute someone says, let's have a referendum on the euro, something happens. Everybody who doesn't have rocks on their head wants a German bank account. And as that money floods into those deposit institutions, and those deposit institutions are already paying at negative rates, it becomes catastrophic for them. The only thing that can happen at that time is basically the finance ministry, under Dr. Schäuble, incredibly unlikely, issues tons of bonds to basically sterilise the flows, which would be awesome for Europe and they're not good, but that's never going to happen. So what you'll do instead is you have to put up capital controls. The minute you put up capital controls in that zone, you have blown up the euro. It is that fragile. So populism, as Peter said, is a threat to democracy, but it's also a huge economic threat because that's 40% of world GDP in that area and it's had a crappy 10 years. It's resting on very fragile market foundations and has been held together by a liquidity constraint and volatility constraint. So you know what? Things suck. Thank you.